Our first speaker is Allan Behm. Allan is head of the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute in Canberra. He was previously a public servant, an independent consultant, a political staffer, and is now a think tanker. He has written a number of supposedly non-fiction books and is a commentator in the national and international media. He has a particular interest in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, the verses of Edward Lear, and the writing of Franz Kafka, and speeches by Australian defence ministers and officials. I have the great pleasure to introduce Allan as our first speaker.
I have a very particular interest in absurdity, the theatre of the absurd, and of course the poems of Edward Lear. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a prepared text, and I'm not going to read it out to you. I'm just going to sort of pick little bits of it out, and if anybody wants the prepared text, I'm sure that the IPAN organisers will give it to you. But in a place like this, the Centre for Christianity, I feel that I need a text. So my text for this evening, for this congregation, is, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive." That was written by Sir Walter Scott. And what I want to suggest to you about the AUKUS theme is that it is based on conceit and deceit. Massive deceit and massive conceit. And I'll just pick elements of that out and come to the end fairly quickly because you can question, and many of you want to talk yourselves. But what I want to suggest here is that the AUKUS idea is a cocktail of conceits, which are inflated ideas, puffed up ideas, and deceits, which may be lies or just may be misleading statements. And what it's done is has created a nest of pipe dreams, of castles in Spain, of Shangri-Las and submarine la-la lands. Because that's essentially what AUKUS is. It's a kind of a dream. A bad dream, and being about submarines, very much a wet one. Now, I want to indicate to you that this kind of deceit goes back to the very beginnings of our federation. In 1907, Alfred Deakin went off to London and had a meeting with the Admiralty. And the Admiralty persuaded him that Australia needed 9 submarines and 2 motor torpedo boats. Now, against the advice of his Australian advisors, Deakin agreed to this, he signed up to it, and then promptly lost the election. Can I hear you thinking Scott Morrison? Now, it's important to understand this. He lost the election, and then he got back in for a little while, as you'd probably know. And in 1914, towards the end of the year, 2 submarines, or in May that year, 2 submarines turned up, AE1 and AE2. AE1, very sadly, was lost in the first month of the war. It was lost off Rabaul. And AE2 participated in the ill-fated Dardanelles campaign and was lost at the end of April 1915. We didn't get another submarine for another 50 years. During the 50s and into the 60s, we began to think in Australia about what an independent force structure would look like. And in my opinion, this is maybe not the opinion of everybody in the room, but in my opinion, submarines fit in our force structure and have a real and significant role. Nothing like the AUKUS role, but they do have a significant role. And so in the 60s, we acquired the Oberon-class submarine and demonstrated that our Navy could operate submarines very successfully. And they did. We didn't own the submarines in the sense that we owned the engineering and the designs and the patents. We weren't what is called the parent Navy, but we could operate the submarines. And so as time moved on, we had governments who were thinking more about, well, can we have an independent capacity for submarines? And the governments of particularly the Hawke government came to the view that we should be able to build our own, which was the beginnings of the Collins-class submarine. And whatever one hears and reads about the Collins, it would be my strong opinion that it was actually a very successful project, for reasons I'm going to explain in just a moment. Not at great length, but it was a successful project. It took 25 years for us to get the Collins-class submarine from the beginning to the end. And I'd have to say to you, in 2005, I was part of a team that produced some guidance to the government of the day about how we would replace the Collins class. And here we are, nearly 20 years later, with no plans for an indigenous build of a submarine. Aspiration and conceit, but no plans for doing it. And even on those grounds, I think you'd have to say Collins was pretty good. Now, it's clear, though, that for submarines' time, and lots of it, is of the essence. And take heart from that. Now, I'd like to move fairly quickly to where we've come over the last decade, and it has really been extraordinary when the deceit that sat behind the decisions of Deakin was carried through, first of all by Prime Minister Abbott, who, in his bromance with Prime Minister Abe, decided that we needed the Japanese submarine. Now, how on earth he came to that decision, I know that there was no concentrated policy advice out of the Defence Department. It came out of the blue. But I think a number of us suspect where it came from. And it came from somebody who was possibly a cross between an armchair strategist, a reader of Biggles books, or something in between. But in any case, we had a quick flirtation with the Soryu-class submarine, and then we realised that that was not going to be a goer for Australia for a lot of reasons. Not least of all, that its technology predated the Collins class that we were thinking the Soryu class could replace. So then came along Prime Minister Turnbull, who had a bit of a French affair, and decided that we would acquire the French submarine, which most Australians thought, well, the French build submarines, they've got a submarine called the Barracuda, so Australia will buy the Barracuda. The French Barracuda is a nuclear-powered submarine, but we weren't going to get a nuclear one because we can't manage nuclear things in Australia. That was the argument of the government. And so we were going to have that submarine completely redesigned by putting diesel engines in it rather than nuclear ones. Now, that's no easy thing, because the naval architects will tell you that the moment you start tampering with mass distribution in a submarine, its buoyancy changes. Not only the front and the back, but it's up and down. And it was no easy thing to go from the Barracuda to a diesel-powered Barracuda, but the French were going to do it for us, and we would have paid through the nose. Prime Minister Morrison had a different view. And I think of all of those decisions taken in the last decade, in most respects, Morrison's decision was the most cynical, because his decision was only for political effect. And this is where I think deceit is really an important part of the history that has got us to this moment in AUKUS. The deceit there lies in building up a very, very strong sense of fear within the Australian community that we are under direct threat from an aggressor that's going to come down here and take the country over. And there is a word that shall not be named. It begins with C and ends with A. It is not Canada and it's not Cuba. Now, anybody who thinks that China actually constitutes a military threat to Australia is out there in La La Land. It's got many risks for Australia, of course it has, and for the region in which we live. But military risk, that really does need to be demonstrated. But what the government of Morrison did was play on that and give Australians a sense that the only way forward was to get a highly powered nuclear submarine that could go very fast underwater and that could sink the Chinese fleet before it leaves Hainan. Now, I can't speak for Hugh, but Hugh will speak for himself in a minute. But we did work together for a long time, and our force structure in Australia was never premised on taking the war to the adversary. It was always premised on defending ourselves against the adversary. There's a big difference in risk, but also in the race of success. And I just want to mention that because there is a deceit involved in turning over what is effectively 50 years of strategic policy, but without explaining to anybody why or how that has happened. That's a deceit. Did the government tell us lies? No. It just didn't tell us the truth. And they're not exactly the same thing, are they? So here we are in a kind of a bind. And this is where I think we do need to pay really serious attention to Edward Lear, who I think summed it up really well. They went to sea in a sieve, they did, in a sieve they went to sea. In spite of all their friends could say, on a winter's morn, on a stormy day, in a sieve they went to sea. And in all of this, I think it is important to understand that you must always premise really major capabilities such as submarines against the reality of your defence needs. And you've got to look at those spends in terms of the opportunity costs that go with those spends. At this point, the government talks about $368 billion. I have no idea where that figure came from. I can't work it out. But I can tell you one thing, it's the rule of three. Whatever any government says they're going to spend on defence, multiply by 3, and you come very close to the outturned figure. I hope your maths is as good as mine, because it's over $1 trillion. Now just bear that in mind, I think. I'd like to conclude by telling you about what happened to me this afternoon. I love deceit because it makes me angry, and anger is what tends to drive me on a bit. You might have picked it up. I read this appalling paper this afternoon. It's called The University Sector's Value Proposition for AUKUS. What? And this is a paper which essentially says, and I'm going to give you a one-sentence précis, and there'll be a test at the end of this tonight. I want you to tell me what my one-sentence précis actually means. The one-sentence précis is this. The universities will create a social licence for AUKUS by demonstrating the strategic intent of AUKUS. Stop. And if any of you understand what that means, you understand AUKUS.
Thank you, Alan.